on the outside, he's very charismatic, so it seems very loving, and there's no doubt in my mind that she loves him, and I know that, and from how I've always seen it, he loves her.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. In the latest legal filing, the Laundries claim that their silence didn't cause distress. What do you think about that? There is a saying that silence implies consent in law, but one wonders whether in this case a different inference can be drawn. Could it be contempt? The Petito's daughter was missing, murdered as it turned out, and their son, her fiancé, wasn't telling what happened, and apparently the Laundries didn't ask. Or did they ask? Did they ask and then they reserved the right not to share what they knew? And is that okay? That's so not okay on so many levels, or that's certainly what it feels like. To even attempt this particular counter, it just feels like it shows a shocking lack of humanity. So somebody goes missing, it's actually your daughter-in-law, but I don't really owe to anyone to tell anyone what I know. I don't have to help anybody. And so I think it's the article from Insider, there's a quote dealing with a matter of law. I think it's from one of the lawyers, a dude called Luca. He says, quote, "As a matter of law, the Laundrie silence could not form the basis of a claim for intentional infliction of emotional distress." So is that just unintentional distress? Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I do want to continue my series on the Moab incident. I think I've done 6 or 7 episodes. I do still intend to continue with that throughout the month of April. But in terms of this question on distress, beyond the impact on the Petito family, I have to say if the law actually supports what amounted to, it felt like it was the hindering actually a double investigation, not just into the circumstances surrounding Gabby, but Brian as well. If that is, if the law actually supports that, I wonder whether the law should not be updated or altered to compel persons of interest and persons with particularly intimate knowledge of other persons involved in a crime to at least make some sort of legal statement. Now, I suppose the danger is that innocent people may be accidentally or purposefully coerced into potentially making incriminating statements if this was made into a kind of a law. And so removing that freedom might not be a step in the right direction. One would imagine, however, if human remains are discovered, if you have a scenario where human remains are discovered and there is an aspect of parental custody or some sort of parental control or influence over a suspect, that parents ought to have some sort of civic duty to volunteer evidence based on their relationship with their progeny, right? So based on that relationship, there should be, or shouldn't there be, some sort of assumption of some degree of responsibility, even if you make the statement to say, I don't know anything. And so to not do so, what about having a situation where you expect a kind of civic duty, and if they refuse to comply, then there's at least a fine. But to have absolutely no sanction does that seem fair? I do think there ought to be some incentive, some instrument that prevents the guarded, some might say guilty silence we witnessed in this case. Now, to go back to the article from the Insider, quote, "If the Laundrie's act of doing nothing other than maintaining their privacy and silence is enough to subject them to this supposed cause of action, then there would be virtually no limitations on the tort of intentional infliction of emotional distress and the fundamental right to remain silent under any circumstances would be obliterated. That is the legal position in terms of challenging this right to remain silent. One's also got to wonder, are we talking about the right to remain silent when you're asked by, when you are spoken to by investigators and the police? What about just ordinary talking to other family members who have an interest in their own family member? Anyway, the article goes on to say, quote, last month, Joseph Petito and Nicole Schmidt said the defendants knew of the mental suffering and anguish they were experiencing while their daughter was missing. I think that is an accurate statement just based on, you would have seen and heard all about that in the news media. It was quite well known that they were traumatized and troubled. And who wouldn't be in that situation? And so the Laundries had to have known about that, and they had access to someone who seemed to have inside knowledge, with a van being driven right to their driveway. And then the article goes on to say, quote, but they refused to disclose information about her whereabouts. And in doing so, they acted with malice or great indifference, according to the lawsuit. I don't know whether they acted with malice, but it does seem as though there was great indifference, doesn't it? The article goes on to say, quote, while the defense said it's sympathetic to the emotional pain Petito's loved ones must still be suffering, Laundrie's parents said they can't be held responsible for it. I've kind of got a question around that, and that is, hasn't everything kind of been done and dusted? So we know that Gabby was murdered. We know Brian's fate. And even now, the Laundries haven't really made a statement. The Laundries, even now, haven't said what they know regarding Brian. And so one still wonders what that's all about. Don't they have some responsibility to I don't know, is it the greater good, the public, the Petitos? Now, if we expand the narrative to include Brian, and we see that within this envelope of intractable silence, Brian also died, and that too was within the context of a long, fruitless search for Brian, in which the parents, also in that case, seem to offer not much help or no help, only to stumble on his remains. I mean, the parents seem to stumble on his remains when all was said and done. The solution here doesn't appear to be to support the notion of those capable of coming to the aid of others not doing so. In other words, the solution doesn't seem to be saying not coming to the aid of others, that's absolutely fine. So in my view, the legal focus shouldn't be on this thing of the right to remain silent. That shouldn't be the sole purview of this, of sort of testing the legalities. I think instead the legal focus should be on the duty of care that all people have to act in a reasonable manner to render aid when they have important information or they have the capacity to help somebody else. So in other words, you have a duty of care to render aid when you are able to do so. In other words, if let's say you have the capacity to help or save someone, but you elect not to do so, your silence ought not to be seen as a watertight defense, right? I think that's different to the right to remain silent. It is electing to remain silent instead of actually assisting law enforcement. Now, think about it in comparison, say, to a lifeguard that is on duty. Now, but think about it in the sense that a parent, in a sense, can be compared to a lifeguard on duty, just as a parent who is always on duty when the welfare of their own children are at stake. So I don't think what I'm talking about here is there's a difference between someone insisting on their right to remain silent, and it's with regard to a stranger or something like that, compared to a parent who is insisting on this right to remain silent with regard to people that are sort of essentially under their own custody. And I suppose you could argue that both Brian and Gabby were adults, but were they really? Were they not dependent financially and in some other ways on their parents? I mean, what did Brian do the moment after committing the crime? He went to his parents, right? So the authorities, incidentally, are also tasked with the welfare of protecting and serving the interests of individuals and society. So what if you have the authorities, and I'm just comparing the authorities to parents. The authorities say, I reserve the right not to do anything in a situation where you would expect that they would do something. In any event, the article goes on to say, quote, Christopher and Roberta Laundrie knew of the mental suffering and anguish of Joseph Petito and Nicole Schmidt, knew that they could alleviate, at least in part, such mental suffering and anguish by disclosing what they knew about the well-being and location of the remains of Gabrielle Petito, yet they repeatedly refused to do so. Now, the part that I disagree somewhat in terms of the suit is where they say the Petitos claim the Laundries planned to help their son escape. I don't know if that's true. It might be true, but we don't know. And so I know the Laundries want the case thrown out. It would be interesting if the case does go to court, whether this allegation can be proved one way or the other. Because certainly if they were doing that, then you could understand their silence in a way, meaning there would kind of be a point to their silence. So to conclude, I think if the circumstances indicate a particular level of danger or foul play, for example, where you have human remains actually discovered, and a parent is in a position to act in a way to help authorities facilitate an investigation, and they do not. Aren't we talking about an accessory to an inferred action? I mean, isn't that what the grand jury decided in the John Benet Ramsey case? You know, you are aware of something, but you don't do anything about it. It's a question. Can one really argue that the Laundries did not aggravate the circumstances by not cooperating? Can one really argue that the Laundries did not aggravate the circumstances by not even communicating kind of whatsoever? So the question remains, if you do not help, how can it be said that you did not hinder? And so it'll be interesting how the law is resolved in this particular instance. And so I'm not going to take it further than that. For those of you who've gotten very excited about my announcement going to CrimeCon, some people have actually reached out to me and contacted me just saying how happy they are to hear the news. I'm both, comforted by that and a little depressed by that because, well, it's April Fool's Day. And so that is the reality of that. Maybe in time I will appear at CrimeCon. We'll see. I guess it depends on them. Maybe if you guys petition them, let them know how much you enjoy my work and how much you value it. Maybe in time they'll see me as a credible speaker worth having on their roster, but certainly not at the moment. That they said they had a backlog that they had to deal with. I did contact them. They had a backlog they had to deal with due to the previous one, I think, being cancelled. And so they had much fewer slots open this year than normal. But anyway, for those who got their hopes up, those who expressed their support, sorry and thank you. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.